The great mystery of Alma Mahler's life is often presented as how did this monstrous, difficult woman get so many great men to love her? I think it's partly because if people have heard of Alma Mahler at all, it's often through the 1965 Tom Lehrer ballad, in which, it's a very funny song where he sort of talks about all modern women being jealous. Alma, tell us, how did you do it? How did you bag Gustav and Walter in France?
Her lovers were many and varied.
She not only was the lover of Oskar Kokoschka, the artist, she married Gustav Mahler, the composer, she then married Walter Gropius, the architect, and then Franz Werfel, the writer, and in between had numerous affairs, and seemed to draw these men, as she said herself, like mosquitoes around a lamp. And yet, by many accounts, Theodor Adorno described her as a monster. Many people who met her or dealt with her found her profoundly difficult, unpleasant, self-serving. And indeed, for the best part of a century, she poisoned much of the legacy of Mahler's music and scholarship by putting out these false accounts of their life together, and even going so far as to reorder the movements in his Sixth Symphony. A few years after his death, she sent a telegram to a leading conductor saying it should be played first scherzo, then andante, even though Mahler himself had always played it andante first, then scherzo, and it makes a huge difference to the atmosphere and mood and the whole structure of that piece of music. And yet so forceful was she that somehow her version of this great work of music was accepted for most of the 20th century. Her first love affair started while she was being celebrated as the loveliest girl in Vienna, in Fin de siècle Vienna. Her father, Emil Schindler, had been this much admired artist. He died, but her mother and stepfather hosted these salons, and she was the belle of these salons, and she had her first kiss, amazingly, aged 17, with Gustav Klimt. She then, aged 20, embarked on an intense love affair with Alexander von Zemlinsky, who was her composition teacher. And he was the first of a series of Jewish men that she entered into relationships with, which is one of the interesting things about Alma Mahler's life, because she was profoundly anti-Semitic. And in many previous biographies of Alma Mahler, there's been an assumption, well, since she married these Jewish men, she must have not really been that anti-Semitic. But this new life, which has come out by Oliver Hilms, which was published in Germany about a decade ago and has only now been translated into English, presents a very convincing case when you see the evidence from Alma's diaries, but also the sort of things that she would just regularly say at dinner parties. The anti-Semitism wasn't something incidental. It was more that she was seeking out these Jewish men in order that she could then humiliate them and lord it over them, force them to worship her, and then reject them. After Mahler died, a friend said to her, "Oh, I really felt that one of the things you did in your relationship with Mahler is that you made him seem less Jewish." And she said she was just welling up with delight. She writes this in her diary. It's there. And that what she'd always wished was to make Mahler brighter, to make everyone brighter. And this becomes a kind of euphemism for making people more Aryan. She was a huge admirer of Wagner from her earliest youth. And she said at one point, no Jew could ever understand Wagner. But then one of the things she liked about Zemlinsky, despite the fact he was Jewish, he did appreciate Wagner, so he had that going for him. But she, again, it's documented in letters, in diaries, in third-person accounts. She would keep saying to him, I don't like you, you're ugly, you're Jewish, I'm better than you. And he would keep saying to him, why are you talking to me like this? I thought we're meant to be in love. Exchanging love for love is what I thought a relationship is about. But that just wasn't how Alma really did things. And you could say, well, that was just one relationship. But then she repeated the pattern with Mahler. And she said the most terrible things about the children that she had with Mahler. She had 4 children, but only one of them, all 3 of them died, and one of them, Anna, who was one of the children she had with Mahler, survived. And she would say quite openly to friends that she preferred the child that she'd had with Gropius because she was Aryan and she was therefore an angel, whereas Anna was a kind of half-breed. What was motivating her in seeking out this string of powerful men? There was something religious as much as sexual about it. It came out really strongly and unpleasantly in her relationship with Werfel. There's it's not completely clear that this was the case, but there's circumstantial evidence that after he died of a heart attack in his mid-50s, she forced a Christian baptism on him on his deathbed, even though they had repeatedly argued about the fact that he wanted to maintain his Jewish faith. He hated it when she would make these outbursts. They'd go to dinner parties in California. By this point, this is after the war, they were part of the German California scene. They were friends with people like Thomas and Heinrich Mann. And Alma would be heard openly saying things like, oh, I think the concentration camps, they were fabrications put out by the Jews. Or when she got really drunk. I mean, it clearly was a problem that was fundamental to her, but it was exacerbated by drink. And by the end of her life, she was drinking a bottle of this filthy stuff, Benedictine, every single day. And she would say things like, I'm not a Jew, you forget I'm not a Jew and you are. Or one Christmas, she wrote in her diary how terrible it was for her to spend Christmas with Werfel, who was meant to be her beloved husband, because he and his friend, who was also Jewish, forgot that here was a Christian woman thirsting for her childhood. Hilms gives a rather psychoanalytic reading of Alma's motivations and feels that they all go back to her relationship with her father. And clearly he was a critical influence on her. He was called Emil Schindler and he was a landscape painter. He was much celebrated and patronised by the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. And she adored him. And Hilms suggests that she almost became like a kind of substitute spouse for him, because Alma's mother was conducting an affair kind of semi-privately, semi-publicly under Schindler's nose, and that maybe Schindler was aware of this and therefore became excessively close to Alma. But certainly from everything that she wrote in her diaries, she adored him. She felt no man was ever so musical, no man was ever so bright. He told her to read Goethe's Faust. He talked to her about poetry. He had a wonderful voice. He sang Lieder, these German songs, which maybe then encouraged her to become a composer after he died. And she said she wanted to do a great thing like a man. I think he died very suddenly of appendicitis when she was 13. And it was as if she'd lost her sense of self. She wrote things about how without his affirming look of kindness from his blue eyes, she didn't really know who she was. And Hilms's reading is that somehow this gave her a lifelong sense of inferiority. I feel that's slightly overblown, slightly too schematic. But her father was clearly a critical influence. The feminist defence of Alma Mahler would be that it was tremendously difficult for her to be forced in a way by circumstances to sublimate her own creative impulses. And that partly explains why she was so forceful in her relationships with these men. So on the eve of her marriage to Mahler, he wrote her this famous 20-page letter, which goes on and on and on, setting out his terms for marriage. And he said that much as he loved her, he did not wish to have a marriage of two composers. He said, do you have any idea how ridiculous this would make us look, to be rivals? And he said, I want a wife, not a colleague. And Alma agonised about it and thought, but I love my own art, but then decided that she loved him more and went for it. So the feminist defence would be to say, well, Alma was a very talented composer in her own right. Her series of Lieder, which is all that remains, are, if not up there with Mahler's own music, remarkable compositions, and who knows what she might have achieved if she'd carried on writing. But to say that she was a hapless victim of Mahler's misogyny is to ignore her own tremendous will to power. And it's also to ignore the choices she had at this point. She quite consciously entered into a relationship with Mahler, who is a more powerful figure on the Viennese music scene, rather than Zemlinsky, who adored her and who was perfectly happy for her to carry on composing. So I think she actively chose the route of being a muse because she felt it was a greater form of power to drive these men on to greatness. And she would quite explicitly write things to them, like she wrote to Gropius, the more you achieve, the more I will love you. She really forced them out into the world, and she was quite vicious to Werfel about how his public speaking wasn't good enough and he needed to write better novels, and really she drove them on in order to give herself greater glory. And with another charming thing about her, after she was Werfel's widow after all. I mean, yet we call her Alma Mahler. And that's, again, something that she engineered herself. And it was Werfel that she should have been mourning and remembering. She had a far longer relationship with him. He was the one who had died last. But nobody really reads Werfel's books anymore. And as his star began to wane and Mahler's rose ever brighter, she really loved the role of being Mahler's widow. So she didn't leave behind very much music, but she did compose this series of Lieder, which towards the end of their relationship, after Mahler found out that she was cheating on him with Gropius and hoped to gain back her affections, he arranged for these Lieder to be published and performed at world premieres in New York. And they're really good, interesting pieces of music. They're not up there with Mahler, they're not the greatest songs you've ever heard, but they have a kind of Brahmsian quality to them, really interesting harmonics. And you can somehow tell, I mean, it's clearly that there's a strong influence for Zemlinsky because obviously he was her teacher. And it's interesting that he was also teaching Schoenberg at the same time. And there are some kind of almost Schoenberg-esque elements to some of the chromatic harmonies, and there are these kind of soaring leaps, and there's one which I somehow feel exemplifies her the most, which is called In meines Vaters Garten, in my father's garden, and it's as if she's trying to get back to Emil Schindler's garden where she felt happy and innocent. And you could also, if you wanted to have an autobiographical reading of them, see them as this projection of herself. She saw herself as this innocent, beautiful Aryan woman wandering through the blossoms. And yet the reality, Elias Canetti, who met her in the 30s, said she was an overbearing, glassy-eyed woman who looked several decades older than she actually was spouting these evil things. But in her head, she's still this innocent belle, the loveliest girl in Vienna. And to listen to the Lieder is to get some sense of the possibilities maybe of a different Alma if she had taken the route of pursuing her own art in its own right, rather than living this vicarious existence through a series of great men.